Hello, and welcome back to Sleepy History 5.00. Tonight, we are going to travel back nearly 1,000 years to a world of stone castles, dusty roads, candlelit churches, and distant kingdoms. Our journey follows one of the most dramatic movements in medieval history, the First Crusade. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these long, peaceful historical stories. It costs nothing, and it helps us continue creating relaxing journeys through the past. And do one more thing for me. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is where you live. Somewhere across the world, another person may be awake right now, listening to the same story beneath a completely different sky. Now settle in. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breathing slow down. Put away the worries of the day. Tonight, we are going back to the year 1095. Europe was changing. Kings ruled distant lands, nobles controlled castles and villages, and the Christian church held enormous influence over everyday life. Beyond Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean was a crossroads of peoples, religions, languages, and empires. Far to the east stood Jerusalem. For Christians, Jews, and Muslims, the city carried a meaning far greater than its walls and streets. And in 1095, something happened that would change the history of Europe and the Middle East. Pope Urban II called upon Western Christians to journey east. His message would inspire knights, nobles, peasants, priests, and adventurers to leave their homes and travel thousands of miles toward the Holy Land. They would face hunger, disease, violence, deserts, mountains, and powerful armies. Many would never return. But before the armies marched, before the famous battles began, there was only a speech and a promise that would set thousands of people on a road toward Jerusalem. And so, beneath the quiet night sky of our own time, we begin with the world that existed before the First Crusade. In the autumn of 1095, Pope Urban II arrived at the French town of Clermont. Thousands of people had gathered to hear him. They came from villages, towns, monasteries, and noble households. Some were curious, others were deeply religious, and many had no idea that the speech they were about to hear would help begin one of the most famous expeditions of the Middle Ages. Urban spoke about Christians in the East and the dangers surrounding the holy places. He called upon Western Christians to take up the cross and travel east. The response was extraordinary. People began repeating the message in churches and marketplaces. Preachers carried the idea from town to town, sometimes adding their own dramatic words and stories. For ordinary people, the journey seemed almost unimaginable. Jerusalem was thousands of miles away. There were no modern roads, trains, or comfortable ships waiting to carry an army across Europe. Travelers would walk for weeks and months, sleeping outdoors or in crowded settlements, crossing rivers and mountains, and depending on local communities for food. Yet enthusiasm spread. Knights began preparing their horses and weapons. Nobles considered how they would finance such an enormous journey. Poorer people also became interested. For some, the expedition was an act of religious devotion. For others, it offered adventure, escape from poverty, or the possibility of a new life. The symbol of the crusade was simple: a cross. Those who joined often took cloth crosses and attached them to their clothing. It became a visible declaration that they had made a sacred commitment. But the movement did not have a single leader. Several armies would eventually travel east, led by different princes and nobles. Before these great armies were ready, however, another movement began. It was made up largely of ordinary people: peasants, laborers, minor knights, women, children, and wandering preachers joined the crowds. They followed charismatic religious figures who promised that the road to Jerusalem was waiting for them. One of the most famous was Peter the Hermit. Soon, thousands were moving eastward. They had little military training and even less understanding of what awaited them. Their journey would become the first great test of the crusading movement, and it would reveal just how dangerous the road to the Holy Land could be. The first great crowds began moving east in 1096. They traveled through the lands of the Holy Roman Empire and into Hungary, following roads that had been used by merchants, pilgrims, and armies for generations. But this was not a peaceful pilgrimage. The enormous crowds needed food, water, shelter, and money. Many travelers had little of any of these things. Some groups became violent. In parts of Europe, Jewish communities were attacked by Crusaders who wrongly connected local Jewish people with the enemies they imagined they were going to fight in the East. These attacks became one of the darkest aspects of the movement. Meanwhile, the People's Crusade continued toward Constantinople. At its center was Peter the Hermit, a preacher whose influence had helped inspire thousands. The travelers eventually reached the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, must have seemed almost unbelievable to many of them. It was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the medieval world. Massive walls surrounded it. Golden churches, busy markets, ships, palaces, and crowded streets revealed a civilization very different from the villages many Crusaders had left behind. The Byzantine emperor was Alexios I Komnenos. He had originally hoped that Western knights might help him recover territories that had been lost to the Seljuk Turks. But the arrival of huge, poorly organized crowds was not exactly what he had expected. The emperor understood something the Crusaders did not. The lands ahead were dangerous. The Seljuk Turks were experienced warriors, and Anatolia was vast. Still, Alexios arranged for the People's Crusade to cross the Bosporus. The Crusaders entered Asia Minor. For a short time, their journey continued successfully. But they soon reached territory where their lack of military discipline became a serious weakness. Near the city of Nicaea, a large group of Crusaders encountered Turkish forces. The result was disastrous. The People's Crusade was surrounded and attacked. Many were killed or captured. Others escaped back toward Constantinople. The survivors had learned a brutal lesson. The Holy Land was not simply waiting at the end of a road. Between Europe and Jerusalem stood mountains, deserts, fortified cities, powerful armies, and enemies who knew the land far better than they did. And the real crusading armies had not even arrived yet. While the People's Crusade was collapsing in Asia Minor, a very different force was preparing in Western Europe. These were the armies of the great nobles. They were not one single army, but several groups traveling by different routes. Among their leaders were Raymond IV of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, and other powerful princes and knights. Unlike many of the earlier pilgrims, these men had military experience. They brought trained soldiers, horses, armor, weapons, servants, priests, and enormous supplies. But preparing such an expedition was expensive. Some nobles sold or mortgaged lands to finance the journey. Others gathered money from their followers and churches. They understood that the road ahead might take years. Eventually, the different armies began moving east. Some traveled overland through the Balkans. Others crossed the Adriatic and Mediterranean by ship. Their destination was Constantinople. When the Western armies finally began arriving, Emperor Alexios I faced a difficult situation. He had requested military assistance. Instead, thousands of heavily armed Western warriors had arrived at his capital. The Byzantines and Western Europeans were both Christians, but they were separated by language, politics, culture, and decades of mistrust. The emperor worried that these powerful nobles might conquer Byzantine territory for themselves. The Crusaders, meanwhile, expected the emperor to provide supplies and support. Neither side completely trusted the other. Eventually, agreements were made. The Crusader leaders swore loyalty to the emperor and promised, at least in principle, to return former Byzantine territories captured from the Turks. Then the armies crossed the Bosporus. This time they were organized. They had experienced commanders and cavalry. They also had engineers capable of building siege equipment. Their first major target was Nicaea. The city was strategically important and heavily defended. For the Crusaders, the siege would be their first major military test. For the Byzantines, it was an opportunity to regain a vital city. And for the defenders inside Nicaea, an enormous Western army was now gathering outside their walls. The First Crusade had truly begun. The siege of Nicaea began in the spring of 1097. The city was protected by enormous stone walls and towers. For centuries, Nicaea had been an important center of the region, and its defenses were designed to withstand serious attacks. Outside those walls, the Crusader armies established their camps. Thousands of soldiers gathered beneath banners bearing crosses and the symbols of their noble leaders. The atmosphere must have been strange. Some men had traveled from France, others from Normandy, southern Italy, and distant parts of the Holy Roman Empire. They spoke different languages, followed different commanders, and had different reasons for coming. Yet they were now gathered around the same city. The Crusaders began constructing siege equipment. Wooden towers, ladders, and other machines were prepared to attack the walls. But Nicaea had an unexpected advantage. The city stood beside Lake Ascanius. The defenders could receive supplies by water, making a complete blockade difficult. The Byzantines understood this problem. Emperor Alexios sent ships toward the lake. The Byzantine fleet helped prevent supplies from reaching the city. Slowly, the defenders became more isolated. The fighting around the walls was intense. Crusader soldiers attempted to approach the fortifications while defenders fired arrows and dropped stones from above. Siege warfare was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. A single mistake could kill dozens of men. Then, after weeks of pressure, something unexpected happened. The defenders inside Nicaea began negotiating with Emperor Alexios. The city was prepared to surrender, but not directly to the Crusaders. Instead, Byzantine forces entered the city and took control. When the Crusaders discovered what had happened, many were furious. They had expected to capture the city themselves. Instead, Byzantine soldiers now controlled its gates. Yet the larger agreement remained intact. The Crusaders continued their march east. Their next destination was not Jerusalem. Before they could reach the Holy Land, they had to cross the vast lands of Anatolia. And there, the Turkish forces were waiting. The road ahead would lead them toward one of the most important battles of the entire expedition. A battle that would determine whether the Crusader armies could survive their journey through Asia Minor. After leaving Nicaea, the Crusader armies entered the heart of Anatolia. The landscape was different from the lands they had known in Western Europe. There were wide plains, dry valleys, rugged mountains, and long stretches where water and food were difficult to find. The army had to move carefully. Thousands of people traveled together, including soldiers, servants, priests, merchants, and families. Their enormous numbers made the column difficult to manage. In June 1097, the Crusaders reached the region near Dorylaeum. They did not know that a large Turkish army was waiting nearby. The Turkish commander was Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk ruler of the Sultanate of Rum. He had underestimated the Crusaders. After the fall of Nicaea, he believed they might be divided and vulnerable. So he attacked. The first Crusader forces to encounter the Turks were commanded by Bohemond. Suddenly, mounted Turkish archers appeared across the plains. They moved quickly, firing arrows before retreating, then returning again and again. The Crusaders struggled to respond. Their heavily armored knights were powerful in close combat, but the Turkish cavalry could remain at a distance. Bohemond's troops formed a defensive position. They gathered their wagons and shields into a protective circle and waited for help. The situation became desperate. Men were wounded, horses collapsed, water became scarce. Then, from the horizon, another Crusader force appeared. More armies arrived under leaders including Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse. The balance began to change. The Crusaders attacked the Turkish positions from several directions. Their armored cavalry finally reached the enemy at close range. The Turkish army began withdrawing. The battle ended in a Crusader victory, but the victory came at a cost. Many men had died, and the survivors still had an enormous distance to travel. Dorylaeum had shown both sides what the Crusaders were capable of. The Turks had discovered that this was no ordinary pilgrimage. The Crusaders had discovered something equally important. They could win, but they could also be destroyed if they became careless. And now the long march toward Syria was beginning. After the battle at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders continued eastward. Their victory had opened the road, but the journey became even harder. Anatolia was enormous, and the army could not simply march from one friendly town to another. Much of the land was controlled by Turkish forces, while other areas offered little food or water. The summer heat became exhausting. Men struggled beneath their armor, while horses suffered even more. Supplies began to disappear. Some soldiers became sick. Others died along the road. The Crusaders had won a major battle, but there was no easy path to victory. Instead of remaining together as one enormous army, the different groups sometimes separated while traveling. This made movement faster, but it also created danger. A smaller force could easily be attacked. Still, the army slowly crossed Anatolia. They passed through valleys and settlements, following roads that had connected the eastern Mediterranean with the interior for centuries. Eventually, they reached the city of Antioch. Antioch was not simply another town. It was one of the most important cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Its walls were massive, its location was strategic, and whoever controlled it could influence the roads leading toward Syria and beyond. For the Crusaders, Antioch became a major obstacle. They could not simply walk around it. The city had to be taken. In October 1097, the Crusader army began its siege. This time, they would not face a short battle. They would remain outside Antioch for months. The city was defended by strong walls and a determined garrison. Inside, the defenders had access to food and water. Outside, the Crusaders faced hunger. As winter arrived, conditions became miserable. Rain turned the ground into mud. Food prices rose. Animals died. Some Crusaders began abandoning the expedition. Others searched desperately for supplies. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was now struggling simply to survive. Yet the leaders refused to give up. They knew that Antioch stood between them and their ultimate destination. If they could capture the city, the road toward Jerusalem would finally begin to open. But the siege would test their patience, their unity, and their faith more than any battle so far. Winter settled over the Crusader camp outside Antioch. The siege had already lasted for months, and conditions were becoming unbearable. Food was scarce. A loaf of bread could cost far more than an ordinary soldier could afford. Horses and other animals were dying, and some men were forced to eat whatever food they could find. Disease spread through the crowded camps. The Crusaders had come expecting a holy journey, but the reality was becoming a struggle against hunger, cold, exhaustion, and fear. Inside Antioch, however, the defenders still held the advantage. The city had enormous walls, towers, and a strong garrison. Its location beside important roads allowed supplies to reach the city. The Crusaders tried to block these routes, but they could not completely seal Antioch off. Then another danger appeared. A large relief army was approaching. Kerboga, the powerful ruler of Mosul, was gathering forces to rescue Antioch. If he arrived before the city fell, the Crusaders could find themselves trapped between the defenders and a much larger army. The situation became desperate. Some Crusaders began talking about abandoning the siege. Others climbed down the walls at night and escaped. Even some important leaders considered retreat. But the siege continued. Eventually, the Crusaders found an unexpected opportunity. A man named Firas, who was connected with the city's defenses, secretly made contact with Bohemond. Firas offered to help the Crusaders enter Antioch. His exact motives remain uncertain. Perhaps he was angry with the city's leaders. Perhaps he wanted money. Whatever his reason, his information gave the Crusaders something they desperately needed: a way through the walls. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Crusader soldiers climbed a tower using ladders. They entered the city and opened a gate. Suddenly, the Crusaders were inside Antioch. The defenders were caught by surprise. Fighting erupted through the streets. By morning, much of the city was in Crusader hands. After months of hunger and fear, they had finally captured Antioch. But there was a terrible problem. The relief army of Kerboga was already approaching. The Crusaders had captured the city just in time. Now they had to defend it, and they were about to discover that capturing Antioch had been easier than keeping it. The Crusaders had barely entered Antioch when the situation changed completely. Instead of celebrating their victory, they now had to prepare for another siege. Kerboga's army arrived outside the city. It was enormous. The Crusaders suddenly found themselves trapped inside the very city they had fought so hard to capture. Food became scarce again. Their horses were weak. Many soldiers were already sick or wounded, and now a powerful enemy army surrounded them. Inside Antioch, fear spread. Some men tried to escape by climbing down the walls. Others argued that the expedition had failed. Yet the Crusader leaders refused to surrender. Then something happened that transformed the mood of the army. A man named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have discovered a sacred object buried beneath a church. He said that Saint Andrew had appeared to him in visions and revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear believed by Christians to have pierced the side of Jesus. The Crusader leaders were uncertain. Some believed him. Others suspected that the discovery was false. But in the desperate atmosphere inside Antioch, the story gave people hope. The object was found, and many Crusaders became convinced that God was still guiding their expedition. Their confidence returned. The leaders decided they would not wait inside the walls forever. They would march out and confront Kerboga. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders opened the gates of Antioch. Their army moved onto the battlefield. Kerboga's forces were larger, but the Crusaders were determined. The fighting was fierce. Wave after wave of Crusader soldiers advanced. According to later accounts, some believed they saw heavenly warriors helping them. Whether these visions were real, imagined, or simply stories created afterward, the effect was powerful. Kerboga's coalition began to break apart. Different commanders had their own interests and did not always trust him. As the Crusaders attacked, parts of his army withdrew. Soon, what had looked like an overwhelming force was collapsing. The Crusaders had won. Antioch was safe, but victory had come after months of suffering. They had lost countless men to hunger, disease, battle, and desertion. And now another problem remained. Jerusalem was still far away. The Crusaders had been traveling for more than 2 years. Their original goal was still waiting beyond the mountains and deserts of Syria. The road south was about to begin. After the victory at Antioch, the Crusaders did not immediately continue toward Jerusalem. Instead, they remained in the city, and this created a serious problem. The Crusaders had captured Antioch together, but now the question was, who would control it? Bohemond of Taranto wanted the city for himself. He argued that he had played a major role in its capture and that he deserved to keep it. Other leaders disagreed. They had promised Emperor Alexios that captured Byzantine territories would be returned. The agreement was now becoming increasingly difficult to enforce. While the nobles argued, months passed. The Crusaders were supposed to be moving toward Jerusalem, but they were becoming settled in Antioch. Meanwhile, the men and women who had survived the journey were exhausted. Many had been traveling since 1096. Some had left their families and homes years earlier. They had crossed Europe, Anatolia, and Syria. They had survived battles and sieges. Yet the most important destination was still ahead. Jerusalem. Eventually, pressure grew on the leaders. Ordinary soldiers wanted the expedition to continue. They had not traveled thousands of miles simply to remain in Antioch. In early 1099, the Crusaders finally began moving south. Their army was now much smaller than the enormous force that had originally left Europe. Thousands had died. Thousands more had returned home or disappeared along the way. Those who remained were experienced, hardened, and determined. Their route took them along the Mediterranean coast. They encountered towns controlled by different rulers. Some resisted, others preferred negotiation. The Crusaders learned that they did not always need to fight. Sometimes food and supplies could be obtained through agreements. Slowly, the army moved south. The landscape began to change again. The air became warmer, the roads became drier, and every mile brought them closer to the city they had been dreaming about since Clermont. Jerusalem. For many Crusaders, the sight of the city would mean the fulfillment of a sacred promise. But Jerusalem was not defenseless. Its walls were strong. Its garrison was preparing. And before the Crusaders could enter the Holy City, they would have to fight one final and enormous battle. The siege of Jerusalem was about to begin. By the summer of 1099, the Crusaders were finally approaching Jerusalem. For many of them, the journey had lasted almost 3 years. They had crossed rivers, mountains, deserts, and enemy territory. They had survived Dorylaeum, Antioch, hunger, disease, and endless marches. Now the city was close. When the Crusaders first saw Jerusalem, the reaction was emotional. Some soldiers fell to their knees. Others prayed. For people who had spent years imagining the holy city, seeing its walls in the distance must have felt almost unreal. But there was no time for celebration. Jerusalem was controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. The city's governor had prepared its defenses. The walls were strong, the towers were manned, and the Crusaders had no easy way inside. The army immediately began preparing for a siege. But there was a serious problem. They lacked supplies. Jerusalem stood in a dry region, and the Crusaders had arrived during the hot season. Water was especially difficult to obtain. Men had to travel considerable distances to find wells and springs. Food was also limited. The Crusaders had brought little with them. Their long journey had consumed much of what they once possessed. They needed siege equipment, but there was very little timber nearby. So groups of soldiers were sent into the surrounding countryside to search for wood. They found trees and cut them down. Carpenters began constructing siege towers, ladders, shields, and other equipment. Everyone understood that the final assault would require careful preparation. Meanwhile, the defenders watched from the walls. From above, they could see the Crusader camps spreading across the landscape. The city itself was crowded. Soldiers prepared weapons. Civilians gathered food and water. The defenders knew that the attackers had traveled an enormous distance to reach Jerusalem. They also knew that the Crusaders were unlikely to simply leave. For the Crusaders, retreat was almost unthinkable. They had come this far. Their destination had been Jerusalem from the beginning. Now the walls stood between them and their goal. The siege had begun. And for the next few weeks, both sides would prepare for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the city. The siege of Jerusalem continued through the hot summer of 1099. The Crusaders had surrounded parts of the city, but they quickly discovered that simply standing outside the walls would not be enough. The defenses were formidable. Jerusalem's walls were thick and difficult to climb. The defenders could fire arrows down upon anyone who approached. The Crusaders needed siege towers, but building them required wood, and there was little suitable timber near the city. Then help arrived from an unexpected direction. A fleet of ships from Genoa reached the nearby coast. The sailors brought supplies, tools, and valuable materials. Most importantly, they brought skilled craftsmen. With their help, the Crusaders began constructing large wooden siege towers. The towers were enormous structures designed to carry soldiers up toward the walls. The work was exhausting. Trees had to be cut and transported. Wood had to be shaped. Ropes had to be prepared. Every piece had to fit together. Meanwhile, the Crusaders continued to suffer from thirst and hunger. The defenders sometimes launched attacks outside the walls, trying to disrupt the construction. The Crusaders responded by strengthening their camps and guarding the workers. Religious ceremonies also became an important part of the siege. The leaders understood that morale was essential. Before the final assault, the Crusaders organized a barefoot procession around Jerusalem. Priests, soldiers, and pilgrims moved together in prayer. They called upon God for victory. For many participants, this was not simply a military operation. They believed they were fighting for a sacred purpose. But the city defenders had their own beliefs, their own families, and their own determination to survive. Inside the walls, preparations continued. The Fatimid soldiers strengthened their positions and watched the construction outside. The Crusaders knew that time was running out. They could not remain outside Jerusalem forever. Their supplies were limited. Their army was exhausted. Yet their siege machines were almost ready. Two major siege towers were constructed under the direction of the Crusader leaders. One was associated with Godfrey of Bouillon. Another was built for the forces of Raymond of Toulouse. The final assault was approaching. After 3 years of marching, the Crusaders were now only one wall away from their goal. But crossing that wall would be the most dangerous step of the. By July 1099, the Crusaders were ready. Their siege towers stood near the walls of Jerusalem. The largest forces were positioned on different sides of the city. Godfrey of Bouillon commanded the northern assault. Raymond of Toulouse positioned his forces toward the southern side. The defenders understood what was coming. They strengthened the walls and prepared weapons. The Crusaders spent the night making final preparations. Then, before dawn, the attack began. The great wooden towers moved slowly toward the walls. Soldiers pushed them forward while others protected the machines from arrows. From the city, defenders launched missiles, stones, and other weapons. The wooden structures were vulnerable. A single fire could destroy them, but the Crusaders had prepared carefully. They covered parts of the towers with protective materials and continued advancing. Godfrey's tower eventually reached the northern wall. His soldiers lowered a bridge from the tower toward the battlements. For the first time, Crusaders were able to fight directly on top of the city's defenses. The defenders resisted fiercely. The walls became a chaotic battlefield. Men fought with swords, axes, spears, and shields. Some soldiers attempted to climb ladders while others tried to force their way through the gates. The fighting continued for hours. Then the Crusaders achieved a breakthrough. Their forces began entering Jerusalem. Once the walls were breached, the city's defense began collapsing. Crusader soldiers poured into the streets. The defenders attempted to regroup, but the momentum had shifted. Raymond's forces also entered parts of the city. After years of marching and fighting, the Crusaders had finally captured Jerusalem. For many of them, this was the moment they had imagined since leaving Europe. But the capture of the city was followed by terrible violence. Large numbers of people inside Jerusalem were killed. Muslim and Jewish residents were among the victims, and the violence continued through parts of the city. Later accounts described the scene in dramatic terms, sometimes exaggerating details. But there is no doubt that the conquest was brutal. Jerusalem had fallen. The First Crusade had achieved its central military objective. Yet the story was not finished. The Crusaders now had to decide how their new territories would be governed, and how they would survive in a land surrounded by powerful enemies. After Jerusalem fell, the Crusader leaders faced an important question. What would happen next? The army had achieved the goal that had brought it across Europe and the Middle East. But capturing a city was one thing. Keeping it was another. The Crusaders could not simply return home and assume Jerusalem would remain safe. Powerful Muslim rulers surrounded the new Christian-held territories. Egypt was nearby. Syria remained divided among several rulers. And the Byzantine Empire continued watching events carefully. The Crusader leaders now had to create a permanent political structure. Godfrey of Bouillon emerged as one of the most important figures. He became ruler of Jerusalem, although he reportedly avoided taking the title of king. Instead, he was associated with the title defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The exact meaning of his title reflected the religious character of the new state. But Jerusalem needed more than a ruler. It needed soldiers. The Crusader armies were already shrinking. Many knights and pilgrims considered their vows fulfilled and began returning to Europe. This created a serious military problem. The new territories were surrounded by potential enemies, while their own population of Western European warriors was relatively small. The Crusaders therefore had to build fortifications and secure important routes. Castles and fortified towns would eventually become central to the survival of the Crusader states. Meanwhile, news of the conquest traveled back to Europe. Stories of Jerusalem spread quickly. For many Christians in Western Europe, the expedition became a legendary victory. Preachers and chroniclers described the journey as a great religious achievement. But the reality was far more complicated. The First Crusade had caused enormous suffering. Thousands of people had died during the journey. Communities had been destroyed. Jerusalem itself had experienced a violent conquest, and yet, from the perspective of the Crusaders, their expedition had succeeded. They had reached the Holy City. They had captured it. Now they had to defend what they had taken. The First Crusade was therefore not really the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. Across the eastern Mediterranean, new alliances were forming. New enemies were watching, and the Crusaders were about to discover that conquering the Holy Land was much easier than holding it. The months after the capture of Jerusalem were strangely quiet. Many Crusaders had already begun their journey home. Some returned by ship. Others traveled overland through the territories they had crossed years earlier. They carried stories of battles, hunger, strange lands, and the Holy City. But those who stayed behind faced a very different reality. The new Crusader territories were vulnerable. Their armies were small. Their enemies were nearby. And there was no guarantee that Western Europe would immediately send enough soldiers to protect them. Godfrey of Bouillon understood the danger. He and his commanders worked to strengthen their positions around Jerusalem. Important roads needed protection. Ports needed to be secured. Fortifications needed to be repaired or constructed. The Crusaders also needed access to the Mediterranean Sea. Without reliable ports, bringing soldiers and supplies from Europe would be extremely difficult. This was one reason coastal cities became so important in the years that followed. The Crusaders did not control the entire region. Their territory was scattered across parts of the Levant, surrounded by larger Muslim powers. They depended heavily on alliances, diplomacy, local communities, and military strength. Then, in 1100, Godfrey of Bouillon died. His death created another question of leadership. His brother Baldwin traveled from Edessa to Jerusalem and eventually became the first ruler of Jerusalem to formally take the title of king. Baldwin I proved to be an energetic military leader. Under his rule, the Kingdom of Jerusalem expanded its influence. Coastal territories were gradually brought under Crusader control. Ports became gateways for reinforcements arriving from Europe. The new kingdom was beginning to look less like a temporary military occupation and more like a permanent state. Yet the surrounding Muslim rulers were not simply accepting this new reality. They had their own rivalries, political struggles, and ambitions. For a time, these divisions helped the Crusaders survive. But the balance of power would not remain the same forever. The First Crusade had created new borders across the eastern Mediterranean, and those borders would become the stage for generations of warfare. The men who had marched to Jerusalem were now becoming settlers, rulers, merchants, and defenders. Their extraordinary journey had ended, but the history they created was only beginning. The First Crusade had changed the political map of the eastern Mediterranean. Where there had once been territories controlled by different Muslim and Byzantine rulers, new Crusader states now appeared. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the most famous, but it was not alone. To the north stood the county of Edessa. Farther west was the Principality of Antioch. And along the coast, other territories gradually came under Crusader control. These states were surrounded by powerful neighbors. Their survival depended on strong fortifications, skilled commanders, and constant communication with Europe. One of the most important developments was the arrival of military orders. Groups of religious warriors would eventually become famous throughout medieval history. They combined religious devotion with military service. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller became especially important in protecting Crusader territories. Their castles and fortified headquarters became symbols of the Crusader presence. But life in the Crusader states was not simply endless warfare. People continued farming. Merchants moved between ports and inland towns. Local Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived under changing political authorities. Languages and cultures mixed. Western European settlers encountered societies that were far older and more diverse than many of them had imagined. The Crusader states therefore became places of cultural contact as well as conflict. Yet their military position remained fragile. The original armies of the First Crusade had disappeared. Most of the people who had marched from Europe were dead or had returned home. The settlers who remained had to defend territories thousands of miles from their original countries. Their greatest advantage was often political division among their opponents. The Muslim rulers of the region did not always cooperate. They competed with one another for cities, trade routes, and political power. This allowed the Crusader states to survive. But gradually, stronger leaders began to unite these territories. The greatest challenge would come when Muslim rulers stopped fighting primarily among themselves and began focusing on the Crusader states. The First Crusade had created a fragile victory. It would take only a few decades for that victory to be seriously threatened. And when the next great struggle came, the name of one Muslim ruler would become famous across both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. His name was Saladin. Long after the First Crusade ended, the political situation in the Middle East continued to change. The Crusader states survived partly because their Muslim neighbors were divided. But that division would not last forever. During the 12th century, powerful rulers began bringing different Muslim territories under stronger control. One of the most important was Imad ad-Din Zengi. Zengi ruled Mosul and Aleppo and became a major opponent of the Crusader states. In 1144, his forces captured Edessa. This was a major shock. Edessa had been one of the earliest Crusader states, created after the First Crusade. Its fall demonstrated that the Crusader territories were not invincible. News of the disaster eventually reached Western Europe. The response was the Second Crusade. But that happened decades after the events we are following tonight. For the First Crusade itself, the important point is what its victory had created. The Crusaders had not simply captured Jerusalem and disappeared. They had established a political presence that lasted for generations. Their castles, churches, ports, and settlements became part of the complex history of the region. The Crusaders also changed Europe. Stories of the expedition became part of medieval literature and religious culture. Knights who had traveled east became legendary figures. Chroniclers recorded battles and miracles. Preachers used the memory of the First Crusade to inspire later generations. But history also remembers another side. The Crusade caused enormous destruction. Jewish communities in Europe were attacked before the armies even reached the east. Cities such as Antioch and Jerusalem experienced devastating violence. Thousands of people died from combat, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The Crusaders saw their expedition through a religious lens. Their opponents saw the invasion differently. Both perspectives became part of the historical memory. And that is one reason the First Crusade remains so important. It was not simply a series of battles. It was a movement involving religion, politics, economics, personal ambition, fear, faith, and survival. The people who joined it believed they were entering a sacred story. They could not know how deeply their journey would affect the centuries that followed. And perhaps the strangest part is that the journey began with something so simple: a speech, a cross, and thousands of people deciding to leave home. To understand why the First Crusade became so powerful, we have to return to the people who actually joined it. They were not all wealthy knights. Some were nobles with large estates. Others were ordinary soldiers. There were pilgrims, servants, priests, craftsmen, merchants, and families. They came from different parts of Western Europe and spoke different languages. For many, the journey was an enormous personal sacrifice. A knight might leave behind his castle, his lands, and his family. A poor pilgrim might leave behind a village and everything familiar. They had no guarantee of returning. The road itself was dangerous. Disease could spread quickly through crowded camps. Food could disappear. Bandits could attack travelers. Rivers and mountains could become deadly obstacles. And once the armies entered Anatolia, the climate itself became an enemy. Yet people continued. Religion was a major reason. Medieval Christians believed that visiting sacred places could have profound spiritual meaning. The idea of fighting to protect those places was even more powerful. The cross became a symbol of commitment. But faith was not the only motivation. Some nobles saw opportunities for wealth and political influence. Some younger sons had limited prospects at home. Some adventurers were attracted by the possibility of new lands. Others may simply have followed their friends or local leaders. Human motives are rarely simple. The First Crusade was therefore a mixture of sincere devotion, ambition, fear, hope, and opportunity. Once the armies reached the eastern Mediterranean, these different motivations sometimes collided. Leaders argued over cities. Promises were broken. Alliances shifted. The Crusaders fought beside the Byzantines but often distrusted them. They negotiated with Muslim rulers when it was useful and fought them when negotiations failed. This complicated reality does not fit easily into a simple story of heroes and villains. The First Crusade was a human event, and human events are rarely simple. Thousands of individuals made thousands of decisions. Some were brave, some were cruel, some were generous, some were frightened. Together, their decisions created one of the most famous episodes of medieval history. And even after Jerusalem fell, the consequences continued. The new Crusader states would remain part of the political landscape for generations. Their existence would influence European politics, trade, warfare, and religious thought. The First Crusade had ended, but its shadow was only beginning to stretch across history. The First Crusade had ended, but its story did not disappear with the capture of Jerusalem. Across Europe, news of the victory spread quickly. Churches celebrated. Preachers spoke about the journey. Chroniclers began recording the events, turning battles and hardships into stories that would be remembered for centuries. But for the people who had actually survived the expedition, the reality was much less romantic. They had witnessed hunger, disease, death, and destruction. Many had lost friends along the road. Some returned home carrying scars from battles. Others never returned at all. The Crusaders who remained in the Holy Land now faced a difficult task. They had to build a functioning society. Jerusalem needed food. Roads needed protection. Farms had to produce crops. Ports had to remain open so that ships from Europe could bring supplies and new settlers. The new rulers therefore depended on both military strength and ordinary daily life. Farmers continued working the land. Merchants traveled between towns. Craftsmen repaired buildings and produced weapons. Local communities continued living under new political authorities. The Crusader states were never simply European colonies transplanted into the East. They developed within an already populated and complex region. People from different cultures interacted every day. Some relationships were peaceful. Others were shaped by suspicion and conflict. The rulers also had to maintain alliances. A powerful Muslim ruler might be an enemy one year and a useful political partner the next. The same was true among the Crusaders themselves. Nobles competed for influence. Different territories had different interests. The Kingdom of Jerusalem did not always agree with Antioch or Edessa. This political fragmentation could become dangerous. Still, for several decades, the Crusader states survived. Their existence was one of the most lasting consequences of the First Crusade. What had begun as a religious expedition had created new kingdoms and political borders. And far away in Europe, another generation was growing up hearing stories about the men who had marched to Jerusalem. The memory of the First Crusade would inspire future expeditions. But future crusades would never completely recreate the extraordinary combination of circumstances that had made the first one possible. The memory of the First Crusade became powerful in medieval Europe. Stories of the journey were repeated in churches, castles, and marketplaces. For people who had never traveled farther than the next village, the idea of knights crossing entire continents seemed almost unbelievable. Jerusalem became more than a distant city. It became a symbol. Songs and poems celebrated the Crusaders. Chroniclers described battles, hardships, and victories. Some accounts included miracles and visions, reflecting the religious worldview of medieval Europe. But historical memory is rarely completely accurate. Stories often became more dramatic as they were retold. Numbers were sometimes exaggerated. Battles were described in heroic language. The complicated motives of individual people were simplified. Yet beneath the legends was a real event. Thousands of people had actually left Western Europe. They had crossed thousands of miles. They had fought powerful armies. They had endured hunger and disease. And in 1099, they had captured Jerusalem. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Trade between the Mediterranean world and Western Europe increased over time. European merchants became more interested in Eastern goods, ports, and markets. Knowledge also moved between societies. Travelers encountered languages, technologies, medical practices, foods, and ideas that were unfamiliar to them. This did not mean that the Crusades created all these connections. The Mediterranean had connected different civilizations long before 1096. But the Crusades intensified some of those contacts. They also deepened hostility. Religious differences became connected with military conflict. Memories of massacres and conquests remained powerful on both sides. The First Crusade, therefore, left a complicated legacy. It could be remembered as a sacred victory by one community and as a violent invasion by another. Both memories became part of the history of the region. Centuries later, historians would continue debating the motives and consequences of the Crusade. Was it primarily religious? Was it driven by politics and ambition? Did economic interests play a major role? The answer is probably a mixture of many things. Human history is rarely controlled by a single motive. And perhaps that is what makes the First Crusade so fascinating. It began with a call to travel toward Jerusalem. It ended with the creation of new states, new conflicts, and memories that would survive for centuries. The First Crusade also changed relations between Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I had hoped the Western Knights would help recover Byzantine lands from the Turks. The Crusaders did help during the campaign, especially in Anatolia. But trust between them remained weak. Some Crusader leaders wanted to keep the territories they captured. Bohemond eventually claimed Antioch, despite earlier promises concerning Byzantine lands. For the Byzantines, this was a serious betrayal. The Crusade had also exposed deep differences between Eastern and Western Christians. They shared the Christian faith, but their languages, traditions, and political interests were very different. Meanwhile, the Crusader states began developing their own identities. Antioch became a powerful principality. Edessa guarded the northern frontier. Jerusalem became the spiritual center of the new Crusader territories. But these states existed in a difficult environment. Their rulers had to negotiate with neighboring powers, protect trade routes, and constantly prepare for war. Castles became essential. Stone fortresses were built on hills and along important roads. Soldiers could watch the surrounding countryside and respond quickly when enemies approached. Yet walls alone could not guarantee survival. The Crusader states needed soldiers, money, food, and reinforcements from Europe. Their armies were often small compared with the populations and resources of the surrounding Muslim powers. For several decades, political divisions among their enemies helped them survive. But those divisions could not last forever. A powerful ruler who united several territories could threaten the entire Crusader presence. A weak ruler, meanwhile, might give Jerusalem another decade of peace. The balance constantly changed. The men who had personally marched with the First Crusade were slowly disappearing. Their children inherited the castles, towns, and memories left behind. The extraordinary expedition of 1096 to 1099 was becoming history. But the consequences of that journey were far from over. For the people who remained in the Crusader states, life was not always about war. Most people still had ordinary concerns. Farmers needed rain. Merchants needed safe roads. Families needed food and shelter. Markets continued operating, even while armies prepared for battle. Jerusalem itself became a busy center of religious and commercial life. Pilgrims continued arriving from Europe, hoping to visit the places associated with Christian history. The city also remained home to people of different backgrounds and traditions. The Crusader rulers controlled the government, but they could not erase the older cultures of the region. Arabic, Greek, Latin, and other languages could be heard across the Eastern Mediterranean. This mixture created a complicated society. People sometimes cooperated because trade and daily life required it. At other times, religious and political differences produced violence. The Crusader states were therefore neither completely European nor completely separate from the societies around them. They were frontier societies, constantly adapting to their surroundings. Their survival also depended on the sea. Ships from Italian cities such as Genoa and Venice could bring soldiers, weapons, and supplies. These maritime connections became increasingly important. Without them, the Crusader states would have been much more isolated. But while Jerusalem and the coastal territories survived, Edessa remained exposed. It stood far to the north, surrounded by powerful Muslim rulers. This position made it difficult to defend. Eventually, this weakness would become critical. In 1144, decades after the First Crusade, the ruler Zengi captured Edessa. The news shocked Europe. The First Crusader state had fallen. The victory of 1099 no longer seemed permanent. Instead, it became clear that the Crusader states could be lost just as quickly as they had been created. The fall of Edessa would inspire a new crusade from Europe. But that was a different generation and a different story. For now, the important legacy of the First Crusade was clear. It had captured Jerusalem, created new states, and transformed the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet nothing about that victory was permanent. The struggle for the Holy Land would continue for generations. The fall of Edessa in 1144 showed how fragile the Crusader states had become. But the First Crusade itself had ended decades earlier, in a moment when the Crusaders believed they had achieved something extraordinary. They had crossed an enormous distance. They had survived battles that could have destroyed them, and they had captured Jerusalem. Their victory changed the relationship between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Pilgrims continued traveling east. Merchants followed the new routes. Ships connected European ports with the cities of the Levant. The Mediterranean became an even more important bridge between different worlds. But the Crusades also left painful memories. The violence of the First Crusade was remembered by Muslim communities. Jewish communities in Europe also remembered the attacks that had taken place before the armies even reached the east. For Christians, the capture of Jerusalem became a powerful religious memory. The same event could therefore carry completely different meanings depending on who remembered it. This is one reason the First Crusade remains difficult to describe in simple terms. It was a military campaign, but it was also a religious movement. It involved kings and nobles, but also ordinary people. It created new political states while destroying existing communities. It encouraged travel and trade while also producing fear and hatred. Its participants believed they were part of something sacred. Yet their actions were shaped by ordinary human motives: ambition, loyalty, desperation, courage, greed, and hope. The story also reminds us how different the medieval world was from our own. Traveling from France to Jerusalem could take years. News moved slowly. People could spend months knowing almost nothing about what was happening hundreds of miles away. Disease could be more dangerous than an enemy army. A broken supply line could decide the fate of an entire campaign. And a single fortified city could stop thousands of soldiers for months. The Crusaders lived in that world. They had no modern maps or instant communication. They relied on guides, local knowledge, animals, ships, and simple weapons. Yet despite these limitations, they crossed continents and changed history. Their journey began in 1096. By 1099, Jerusalem had fallen, and the world they left behind would never be quite the same. The story of the First Crusade also reveals how important geography was. The road from Western Europe to Jerusalem was not a straight path. The Crusaders crossed forests, rivers, mountains, plains, and deserts. Every landscape created new problems. In Anatolia, the heat and lack of water exhausted the army. In Syria, fortified cities slowed their advance. Near Jerusalem, the dry climate made even basic supplies difficult to obtain. The Mediterranean Sea was equally important. Ships carried people and supplies between Europe and the Levant. Without these maritime connections, the Crusader states would have struggled to survive. The cities along the coast therefore became valuable prizes. Ports provided food, weapons, soldiers, and access to the wider world. Geography also influenced the location of castles. Fortresses were often built on hills, mountain passes, and important roads. From these positions, soldiers could control movement through the countryside. The Crusaders had learned during their journey that controlling a road could be almost as important as winning a battle. But geography was not the only challenge. The Crusader leaders had to manage people with different goals. Some wanted land, others wanted wealth. Some wanted only to complete their religious vow and return home. Keeping such a diverse army together was extremely difficult. This became obvious during the long siege of Antioch. The army nearly collapsed because of hunger and disease. At Jerusalem, the same problems appeared again. Yet the Crusaders continued. Their determination was one of the most remarkable features of the expedition. By the time Jerusalem was captured, the original army had been reduced dramatically. Thousands had died along the road. Others had abandoned the journey. Only a fraction of those who had started in Europe reached the Holy City. Their victory, therefore, came at an enormous human cost. For the survivors, Jerusalem must have seemed like the end of an impossible journey. But history had another plan. The capture of the city did not bring permanent peace. Instead, it created new political borders and new struggles. The First Crusade had opened a chapter that would continue long after the original Crusaders were gone. Its legacy would shape the medieval Mediterranean for generations. By the beginning of the 12th century, the Crusader states were becoming more established. Jerusalem had its own rulers and institutions. Antioch remained an important center in the north. Edessa guarded the frontier. Along the coast, new territories provided access to Mediterranean trade. The settlers who remained gradually adapted to their new surroundings. They built churches, repaired fortifications, opened markets, and established farms. But the memory of the First Crusade remained important. New arrivals from Europe often heard stories about the original expedition. The journey of the First Crusaders became an example for later pilgrims and warriors. For some, it represented courage and devotion. For others, it represented conquest and suffering. Meanwhile, the political situation around the Crusader states continued changing. Muslim rulers competed with one another for control of important cities. Sometimes they fought each other instead of the Crusaders. This gave Jerusalem valuable time. But the Crusaders could not depend on division forever. New leaders were emerging. They were building stronger armies and bringing larger territories under their control. The fall of Edessa in 1144 would eventually demonstrate how dangerous this development had become. Yet the First Crusade itself remained unique. Later crusades would involve larger kings and different political goals. None would perfectly repeat the circumstances of 1096. The original expedition had brought together a mixture of religious enthusiasm, political opportunity, military ambition, and desperation. Its participants could not have known what they were creating. They thought mainly about reaching Jerusalem, but their journey created states that lasted for generations. It also created memories that survived for centuries. The First Crusade, therefore, became more than a military campaign. It became a symbol. For medieval Europe, it could represent the possibility of a sacred mission succeeding against overwhelming odds. For the societies that experienced the invasion, it became a memory of foreign armies arriving from distant lands. Both interpretations would influence later history, and as the generations passed, the people who had actually experienced the First Crusade disappeared. Their castles remained. Their roads remained. Their stories remained. The men were gone, but the consequences of their journey were still alive. As the years passed, the Crusader states became part of the wider Mediterranean world. Their rulers depended on European support, but they also relied on local people and regional trade. Ships from Italian ports arrived with goods and soldiers. Markets connected coastal cities with inland settlements. The movement of people and ideas continued despite the constant threat of war. Jerusalem remained the heart of the Crusader presence. Its churches and sacred sites attracted pilgrims from Europe. For these travelers, reaching the city could be the greatest journey of their lives. They followed roads that earlier Crusaders had fought to secure. Yet, the political situation remained unstable. Alliances could change quickly. A ruler might cooperate with one neighbor while preparing to fight another. The Crusader states had to remain alert. Their castles became permanent reminders of the struggle. Some were built on dramatic mountain peaks. Others guarded roads, valleys, and important ports. These fortresses required large amounts of labor and money. Their walls protected soldiers, but they also represented the determination of the Crusader states to remain. Still, no fortress could guarantee safety forever. The greatest danger was the possibility of political unity among the Crusaders' opponents. If powerful Muslim rulers could combine their armies, the smaller Crusader states could face overwhelming pressure. This gradually became reality. The rise of stronger Muslim leaders changed the balance. Zengi captured Edessa in 1144. Later, Nur ad-Din expanded his power in Syria. And eventually, another ruler would unite Egypt and Syria. His name was Salah ad-Din, better known in the West as Saladin. But Saladin belonged to a later chapter. He was not present during the First Crusade. The Crusaders who captured Jerusalem in 1099 could never have imagined that, less than a century later, their descendants would face such a powerful opponent. For now, their victory still seemed remarkable. A group of warriors and pilgrims from Western Europe had traveled across continents and established themselves in the Holy Land. Their story would become one of the most famous chapters of medieval history, and the memory of their journey would continue long after their kingdoms had disappeared. The First Crusade left behind a complicated memory. In Europe, the capture of Jerusalem was often celebrated as a great Christian victory. Chroniclers wrote about brave knights and difficult battles. Over time, these stories became more dramatic. But historians today can see that the reality was much more complicated. The Crusaders were not one united group with identical goals. They argued with one another. They competed for cities and territory. Some returned home soon after Jerusalem was captured. Others stayed and built new lives. Their opponents were also divided. Different rulers controlled different regions, and their interests did not always agree. This political fragmentation helped the Crusaders succeed. The First Crusade, therefore, cannot be explained only by military strength. Timing, geography, leadership, alliances, and political divisions all mattered. The Crusaders also benefited from unexpected events. The capture of Nicaea came with Byzantine assistance. The victory at Dorylaeum opened the road through Anatolia. Antioch was captured partly because of an insider's help. At Jerusalem, the arrival of ships and skilled craftsmen made the siege possible. Again and again, circumstances changed the course of the expedition. That is one reason the First Crusade remains so fascinating. It was not a perfectly planned campaign. It was a long chain of uncertain decisions. Thousands of people left Europe without knowing what awaited them. Some expected a short pilgrimage. Instead, they spent years fighting across unfamiliar lands. Many never reached Jerusalem. Many who did reach it never returned home. Yet their journey changed the map of the medieval world. New states appeared. Trade routes became more important. European interest in the Eastern Mediterranean increased. And the relationship between Christian and Muslim powers became more deeply connected to the memory of warfare. The First Crusade was therefore both an ending and a beginning. It ended the journey that began with Urban Tuskal, but it began a much longer era of conflict, diplomacy, migration, and cultural contact. The year 1099 marked the capture of Jerusalem. It did not mark the end of the story. It was simply the moment. The First Crusade left behind a complicated memory. In Europe, the capture of Jerusalem was often celebrated as a great Christian victory. Chroniclers wrote about brave knights and difficult battles. Over time, these stories became more dramatic. But historians today can see that the reality was much more complicated. The Crusaders were not one united group with identical goals. They argued with one another. They competed for cities and territory. Some returned home soon after Jerusalem was captured. Others stayed and built new lives. Their opponents were also divided. Different rulers controlled different regions, and their interests did not always agree. This political fragmentation helped the Crusaders succeed. The First Crusade, therefore, cannot be explained only by military strength. Timing, geography, leadership, alliances, and political divisions all mattered. The Crusaders also benefited from unexpected events. The capture of Nicaea came with Byzantine assistance. The victory at Dorylaeum opened the road through Anatolia. Antioch was captured partly because of an insider's help. At Jerusalem, the arrival of ships and skilled craftsmen made the siege possible. Again and again, circumstances changed the course of the expedition. That is one reason the First Crusade remains so fascinating. It was not a perfectly planned campaign. It was a long chain of uncertain decisions. Thousands of people left Europe without knowing what awaited them. Some expected a short pilgrimage. Instead, they spent years fighting across unfamiliar lands. Many never reached Jerusalem. Many who did reach it never returned home. Yet their journey changed the map of the medieval world. New states appeared. Trade routes became more important. European interest in the Eastern Mediterranean increased. And the relationship between Christian and Muslim powers became more deeply connected to the memory of warfare. The First Crusade was therefore both an ending and a beginning. It ended the journey that began with Urban Tuskal. But it began a much longer era of conflict, diplomacy, migration, and cultural contact. The year 1099 marked the capture of Jerusalem. It did not mark the end of the story. It was simply the moment when a new chapter began. By the time the First Crusade became a memory, the people who had begun the journey were already disappearing from the world. Godfrey of Bouillon was dead. Bohemond had moved on to other struggles. Raymond of Toulouse was gone. The ordinary soldiers and pilgrims who had walked beside them had mostly returned home or died along the way. Yet the places they had fought for remained. Jerusalem continued as the center of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Antioch remained an important stronghold. Edessa guarded the northern frontier until its eventual fall. The Crusader states had become part of the political landscape of the region. But their existence was never secure. They needed constant military support. They needed trade. They needed alliances. And above all, they needed time. For several decades, they received enough of these things to survive. Meanwhile, the memory of the First Crusade continued to influence European society. When later preachers called for new crusades, they often looked back to 1099. The original expedition became an example of what a crusading army could accomplish. But later crusaders faced a different world. The Muslim states gradually became stronger and more organized. The political divisions that had helped the First Crusaders were slowly replaced by new alliances. The balance of power was changing. The fall of Edessa in 1144 would prove how serious the change had become. Europe responded with another enormous expedition. The Second Crusade followed. But it would not repeat the success of the first. That difference became an important part of the crusading story. The First Crusade had succeeded under extraordinary circumstances. Its leaders had taken advantage of divisions among their enemies, Byzantine assistance, naval support, and moments of unexpected opportunity. Success could not simply be copied. The Crusaders had won Jerusalem, but they had not created a permanent solution to the conflicts of the region. The struggle continued, and as new generations grew up, the memory of 1099 became increasingly distant. The original pilgrims were gone. Their children remembered their stories. Their grandchildren remembered legends. Eventually, the First Crusade became something larger than the people who had lived through it. It became history. By the time the First Crusade became a memory, the people who had begun the journey were already disappearing from the world. Godfrey of Bouillon was dead. Bohemond had moved on to other struggles. Raymond of Toulouse was gone. The ordinary soldiers and pilgrims who had walked beside them had mostly returned home or died along the way. Yet the places they had fought for remained. Jerusalem continued as the center of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Antioch remained an important stronghold. Edessa guarded the northern frontier until its eventual fall. The Crusader states had become part of the political landscape of the region. But their existence was never secure. They needed constant military support. They needed trade. They needed alliances. And above all, they needed time. For several decades, they received enough of these things to survive. Meanwhile, the memory of the First Crusade continued to influence European society. When later preachers called for new crusades, they often looked back to 1099. The original expedition became an example of what a crusading army could accomplish. But later crusaders faced a different world. The Muslim states gradually became stronger and more organized. The political divisions that had helped the first Crusaders were slowly replaced by new alliances. The balance of power was changing. The fall of Edessa in 1144 would prove how serious the change had become. Europe responded with another enormous expedition. The Second Crusade followed, but it would not repeat the success of the first. That difference became an important part of the crusading story. The First Crusade had succeeded under extraordinary circumstances. Its leaders had taken advantage of divisions among their enemies, Byzantine assistance, naval support, and moments of unexpected opportunity. Success could not simply be copied. The Crusaders had won Jerusalem, but they had not created a permanent solution to the conflicts of the region. The struggle continued, and as new generations grew up, the memory of 1099 became increasingly distant. The original pilgrims were gone. Their children remembered their stories. Their grandchildren remembered legends. Eventually, the First Crusade became something larger than the people who had lived through it. It became history. More than 9 centuries later, the First Crusade remains one of the most studied events of the medieval world. Historians continue examining letters, chronicles, archaeological evidence, and surviving buildings to understand what really happened. The sources do not always agree. Medieval writers often described events from their own religious or political perspective. Some accounts were written years after the battles. Others were created to celebrate particular leaders. Because of this, historians must carefully compare different sources. The result is a picture that is more complicated than the legends. The Crusaders were not simply heroes. Their opponents were not simply villains. They were people living in a violent and uncertain world. They made choices based on faith, politics, fear, ambition, loyalty, and survival. The First Crusade also reminds us that historical events can have consequences far beyond what their participants expected. When Urban II called for the expedition in 1095, he could not have known that his appeal would help create new states in the eastern Mediterranean. The people who followed him could not have imagined that their journey would be remembered for more than 900 years. They were simply trying to reach Jerusalem. Some believed they were serving God. Some wanted adventure. Some wanted land or status. Others may have followed because everyone around them was going. Whatever their reasons, they became part of a movement that changed history. In 1099, Jerusalem was captured. The Crusaders celebrated their victory, but the city would continue changing hands throughout the centuries. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Castles would become ruins. Armies would disappear. Yet the memory of the First Crusade would survive. It would be remembered differently by different peoples, and its meaning would change with time. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is not only about who won a battle. It is also about what people remembered afterward. The First Crusade began more than 9 centuries later. The First Crusade remains one of the most studied events of the medieval world. Historians continue examining letters, chronicles, archaeological evidence, and surviving buildings to understand what really happened. The sources do not always agree. Medieval writers often described events from their own religious or political perspective. Some accounts were written years after the battles. Others were created to celebrate particular leaders. Because of this, historians must carefully compare different sources. The result is a picture that is more complicated than the legends. The Crusaders were not simply heroes. Their opponents were not simply villains. They were people living in a violent and uncertain world. They made choices based on faith, politics, fear, ambition, loyalty, and survival. The First Crusade also reminds us that historical events can have consequences far beyond what their participants expected. When Urban II called for the expedition in 1095, he could not have known that his appeal would help create new states in the eastern Mediterranean. The people who followed him could not have imagined that their journey would be remembered for more than 900 years. They were simply trying to reach Jerusalem. Some believed they were serving God. Some wanted adventure. Some wanted land or status. Others may have followed because everyone around them was going. Whatever their reasons, they became part of a movement that changed history. In 1099, Jerusalem was captured. The Crusaders celebrated their victory, but the city would continue changing hands throughout the centuries. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Castles would become ruins. Armies would disappear. Yet the memory of the First Crusade would survive. It would be remembered differently by different peoples, and its meaning would change with time. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is not only about who won a battle. It is also about what people remembered afterward. The First Crusade began with a call from Clermont. It crossed continents, survived enormous hardships, and ended with the capture of Jerusalem. But its greatest impact was not limited to 1099. Its consequences continued for generations. And tonight, as we slowly leave the medieval world behind, the long journey of the First Crusade is finally coming to its quiet end. And so, our long journey through the First Crusade comes to an end. It began in 1095, with Pope Urban II standing before a crowd at Clermont and calling Western Christians toward the Holy Land. In the years that followed, thousands of people left their homes. They crossed Europe and Anatolia. They survived hunger, disease, battles, and brutal sieges. They captured Nicaea. They fought at Dorylaeum. They endured the terrible siege of Antioch. And in 1099, they finally reached Jerusalem. The city fell after a fierce assault. For the Crusaders, it was the fulfillment of a journey that had taken years. But history did not stop there. The capture of Jerusalem created new kingdoms and new conflicts. The Crusader states survived for generations, but they were constantly threatened by stronger powers around them. The First Crusade also left a complicated legacy. It encouraged travel, trade, and contact between distant societies. At the same time, it caused immense suffering and deepened religious hostility. Different communities remembered the events in very different ways. That is why the First Crusade cannot be reduced to a simple story of victory or defeat. It was a human story, a story of faith and fear, of courage and ambition, of friendship, rivalry, survival, and loss. Thousands began the journey. Only a fraction reached Jerusalem. Many never returned home. Their footsteps disappeared from the roads centuries ago, but their story remains. Tonight, we have followed those footsteps from Clermont to Jerusalem. We have watched the armies cross mountains and deserts, gathered outside ancient walls, and struggled through some of the hardest years of their lives. And now, the roads are quiet. The castles stand silent beneath the night sky. The armies are gone. The banners have disappeared. Only history remains. So, wherever you are listening tonight, let your mind